It's about 10 years ago now that Australia received their first saint, Mary MacKillop. You probably remember. It was on the television and newspapers, and a lot of people were excited about it, and some people a little bit confused as to really what it meant. And certainly Mary MacKillop led a very interesting life. She promoted education for the poor. She even, way back then, took a stand on sexual abuse in the church, and she took on the authorities. Now, it was clearer to people, obviously, within the Roman Catholic tradition what sainthood meant, but to those of us within the Reformed tradition, there was a little bit of a question mark. And it's interesting to note that in the first reading that we had this morning, which is often missed out in lectionaries, it says, Paul, an apostle of Christ Jesus by the will of God, to the saints who are in Ephesus and are faithful. So when Paul dispatched letters to the saints that are in Ephesus, Colossus, and Philippi, he was not addressing a select few. These letters, in fact, were meant for all the church members. And Paul wasn't laboring under any illusion. He was fully aware of the people that of the behavior of the people that he was writing to. Nor was Paul blind to the corporate life of these communities. No congregation in Asia Minor could claim to be without blemish, and no single convert could lay claim to perfection. So clearly, then, in the New Testament sense, a saint doesn't mean a perfect person. In which case, some of us may be tempted to think the words don't really mean very much at all. And so that might be quite comforting. But the New Testament, it doesn't rest there. A saint doesn't mean someone who's already perfect, but it does mean something quite definite. It really means someone who's clearly committed to following the teachings of Jesus, clearly committed. Now, this doesn't mean that we've already arrived or will ever arrive, but it does mean that we're trying and we're on the way. And Paul, for himself, he never claimed that he had arrived. On the contrary, he said in a confession, not that I have already obtained or am already perfect. And he goes on to use an Olympic Games metaphor, but I press on towards the goal. Until recently, people didn't really appear to have been preoccupied with the concept of holiness. One reason, perhaps, is that they find the traditional image of the saint somewhat off-putting. Some saints, after all, were depicted as an elite group who had achieved the impossible. They had scaled dizzy heights of spirituality, and the claims attributed to them are difficult to accept in a scientific age. The saints of old have been projected as rather unusual and very extraordinary human beings, so much so that a whole lot of legends developed about them. And this has had the effect of creating a gulf between them and the rest of the people. It was claimed, for example, that saints could go without food, that their bodies didn't decay at death, and that the corpses of martyrs gave off a sweet smell. Apparently, they were also equally independent of psychological laws. They were never depressed, they were never frustrated, never bad-tempered, never bored, and never self-pitying like the majority of us. Now, a reaction was inevitable against this inflated version of sanctity. And I'm not quite sure when this reaction occurred, but we do meet it in no uncertain terms in Dostoevsky's great novel, The Brothers Karamazov. And the author here paints for us a rather amusing scene. Following the death of the godly elder Father Zosimo, his disciples and friends are determined that, true to the tradition of sanctity, his body shall not decay. And some of his fellow monks, however, felt that his reputation as a holy man was grossly inflated. They objected to his fondness for tea and jam and his popularity with women. So they did their best to ensure that in the sanctity stakes, Father Zosimus' body was a non-starter. And fate seemed to play into their hands, because there came 3 days of very hot weather. And to the most ardent disciple, it became clear that Father Zosimus' body was going the way of all flesh. Now, the author doesn't labor the point. He leaves us, the readers, to draw the moral. It is the fruits of Father Zosimus' life that must define him, not the trivia of his death. And this vision by Dostoevsky is a healthy one and speaks to our condition in a secular age. And what he's really telling us is that holiness, in its major manifestations and in its smallest degrees, is above all ordinary. When it's worn lightly, expressing itself unself-consciously and unexpectedly in acts of caring, that's when it becomes extraordinary. And it's these simple acts of remembering and caring, more than great dramas of martyrdom, that illuminates the life of most of us. They point us to the way that we should live our lives, to learn the art of goodness. And paradoxically enough, they also indicate how easy it is. And in the 21st century, we're bound to examine holiness in the light of new scientific and psychological knowledge. And when we do, we discover that there are certain aspects of traditional piety which we can no longer admire or accept. For example, exaggerated fasting, self-flagellation, foregoing sleep, the exalting of spiritual relationships above human relationships, irrational longings for discomfort, pain, and martyrdom. Yet, we must not feel superior. In these traditional patterns of holiness, there was a great deal of courage, a great deal of beauty, a great deal of joy, and a great deal of love. These people only possessed a primitive understanding of psychology, and in time they came to see the implications of their own self-torment, and they progressed and became more liberated and more mellow. They moved towards wholeness, and they saw the real struggle was between good and evil. So whatever the general shape of the new emerging sanctity, one thing is certain: love will remain. Despite selfishness and aggressiveness The fruits of love will still be visible. We need to arrive at a new understanding of how these seeds of holiness can be coaxed to grow among a wider section of humanity. And make no mistake about it, new holy men and women are amongst us. Roman Catholics, Anglicans, Baptists, Presbyterians, Salvation Army, and even the Uniting Church produce these new holy men and women, these new saints. Some of these saints are found in the fringes of our congregations, and there are others, although they work tirelessly within the church, tend to be, if anything, anti-establishment, and all of them are worldly. But how do we recognize these new men and women? What are their distinguishing characteristics? Well, one such mark is involvement, including immersion in social concern and political justice. That's one mark, involvement. And we can think of famous people of the past, like Mother Teresa with the wonderful work that she did in Calcutta. We can think of Father Borelli, the Catholic priest who identified himself with the poor in the slums of Naples. We can think of Kagawa in Japan, who worked amongst the slums, befriending alcoholics and drug addicts and murderers, and later became a member of the Japanese cabinet. So there's involvement. And another mark of the new saint is unself-consciousness. They're genuinely surprised and really amused, if anyone would call them holy. They're simply committed to doing a job, and there's no flag waving. They keep a low profile. To sum up, in conclusion, one word: we can't make ourselves holy. We cannot attain sanctity by strenuous self-consciousness. Long ago, the philosopher Aristotle stated that happiness cannot be pursued or posed directly. Happiness, properly understood, is always an incidental byproduct. And it's the same with holiness. We become, each of us, holy to the extent in which we are committed to God's purpose disclosed in Jesus of Nazareth, to the extent in which we follow his teachings and care for one another, especially those who are less fortunate than we are. So let us discard all false images of saintliness and instead model our lives on Jesus of Nazareth, a person who was fully human, so that in turn we may become more committed, more saint-like, more truly human, and more fully ourselves.